The sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows on the busy streets below. It was the golden hour, the time of day when everything seemed to glow just a little brighter, as if the universe itself were giving a final, tender nod to the day before nightfall took over. People moved in and out of stores, the usual hum of city life echoing in the background. But in the midst of all the bustling, one particular diner stood still, as though it were a world unto itself. Jamal sat by the window of Earl's Diner, sipping a cup of black coffee, his mind adrift. The soft chatter of the other patrons filled the room, but Jamal didn't really hear it. He had grown used to this space over the past few years, his quiet retreat from the chaos of the world outside. His fingers traced the rim of the coffee cup absent-mindedly. His thoughts were a mix of frustrations and hopes, caught between the fight for justice he'd always dreamed of and the harsh realities of being a black man in America. Jamal wasn't much for small talk. He didn't need the noise of the world to define him. The stillness of his thoughts, the quiet hum of his surroundings, that was where he felt most alive. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen today. Something big, something that would change his life. The sound of the door chime broke his reverie as a figure walked in. A tall man in his late 50s with a weathered face and an air of quiet confidence entered the diner. His posture was rigid, almost military. He wore a neatly pressed shirt, the creases sharp enough to slice through air. His gaze scanned the room, then fell on an empty seat at the counter, where he made his way over. Jamal couldn't help but notice the man. There was something about him, something familiar, yet distant, but Jamal couldn't quite place it. He shifted in his seat, trying to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of his mind. As the man sat down, he caught the eye of the waitress, a young woman with a bright smile. She came over, asking what he'd like. "The special," the man said, his voice rough as if years of silence had worn it down, "and a glass of iced tea. Please." Jamal's attention drifted back to the man. For a second, his eyes locked with the stranger's, and there was a strange recognition that sent a chill down his spine. But the moment passed quickly, and the man returned to his quiet contemplation. Jamal felt an unexpected urge to speak. He'd always been someone who kept to himself, who stayed out of other people's business. But today there was something about the man that tugged at him. He stood up, walked over, and sat beside the stranger at the counter. "Excuse me," Jamal said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of curiosity in it. "I don't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help but notice. You seem familiar." The man looked at him, slightly taken aback, then softened. "I get that a lot," he said with a chuckle, though it sounded bitter. "I guess I have one of those faces." Jamal gave a half smile, but felt the unsettling pull in his chest grow stronger. "Maybe I'm just crazy," he said, more to himself than to the stranger. "I swear I've seen you before." The man tilted his head as if considering Jamal for a moment. His eyes narrowed. "You ever been to Georgia?" "No," Jamal said, shaking his head. "I've never been that far south. But I don't know. You remind me of someone from my childhood." The man leaned back in his chair, studying Jamal more closely now, the lines on his face deepening as he did. A long silence stretched between them before the man finally spoke. "Sometimes life has a way of connecting people who should have met years ago." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" But before the man could respond, the waitress returned with a special and iced tea, placing them down in front of the stranger. Jamal watched as the man's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the glass, his fingers brushing the rim in a way that suggested a lifetime of regret. The man didn't seem eager to continue the conversation. Instead, he picked up his fork and dug into his meal, the sound of metal on porcelain filling the silence. Jamal, however, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this encounter. He leaned forward again. "Look, I don't mean to press, but I feel like there's more to this than just coincidence." The stranger paused, setting his fork down. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking, his voice softer now. "You ever wonder why certain people come into your life when they do?" Jamal felt a pang of discomfort, like a door was about to open that he wasn't sure he was ready for. The man cleared his throat. "Maybe you should know something. I'm not just some random person you're running into today." Jamal's stomach tightened. This was no ordinary meeting. His instincts told him that much. The stranger's eyes met his, and there was a flicker of something Jamal couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or sorrow, or something deeper, something hidden under layers of pain. The man's expression seemed to speak volumes, but his lips remained sealed. "I don't know how to say this," the man muttered, his gaze lowering, "but I've been carrying this for a long time, and maybe it's time you knew the truth." Jamal's heart rate picked up. His hand clenched the edge of the counter, but he kept his voice steady. "What truth?" he asked, his tone cautious, unsure of what he was about to hear. The man seemed to brace himself, and in that moment, Jamal could see it. The years of burdens, the weight of a life filled with mistakes and regret. His eyes flickered to the door for a moment, as if checking to make sure they were alone. Then he leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice to a whisper. "I'm your father." Jamal froze. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating any hope of clarity. His mind raced, trying to process what he'd just heard. His father, the man who'd left him and his mother years ago, the man who had never bothered to reach out, never once sent a letter or a phone call, the man who had disappeared without a trace. "No," Jamal muttered, shaking his head. "That can't be true. You're lying." But the man didn't flinch. His eyes stayed steady, unblinking. "I know you don't believe me," he said quietly, "but I'm telling you the truth. I've been looking for you for years." Jamal stood up abruptly, the shock of the revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger, the confusion. "You've been looking for me?" Jamal's voice was a low growl now, filled with incredulity. "And you think that makes it okay? You left me. You left me and my mom with nothing, and now you want to show up like this? Like you have some kind of right to be here?" The stranger's face hardened, but there was no anger in his eyes, just an aching sadness that Jamal couldn't quite understand. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jamal cut him off. "I don't want to hear it," he spat, backing away from the counter. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not my father." The man's voice shook slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old faded photograph. He handed it to Jamal, his hands trembling. Jamal hesitated, staring at the photograph. His eyes widened as the image slowly came into focus. It was a picture of a younger version of the man, standing beside a woman who looked strikingly like Jamal's mother, both smiling brightly as they posed for the camera. The woman was holding a baby in her arms, Jamal as a child. Jamal's breath hitched. The man wasn't lying. This was real. For a long moment, Jamal stood frozen, the photo burning a hole in his hands. The world seemed to slow, everything around him fading as his mind grappled with the impossible truth. "You don't know how sorry I am," the man said quietly. "I was young, stupid. I made mistakes that I can never undo, but I swear to you, I've never stopped thinking about you." Jamal stood there, the photo still clutched in his hand, his entire body trembling. Anger mixed with disbelief, and he felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him unsteady. "I don't need your apology," Jamal finally said, his voice shaking. "I grew up just fine without you. You think showing up now makes everything okay? It doesn't. You don't get to walk back into my life after everything you did." The man's face faltered, but he didn't speak. He simply sat there, his hands folded in front of him, as if waiting for the storm to pass. Jamal couldn't breathe. The image of his mother, the pain she must have felt. His whole life felt like it was being torn apart in front of him. All the questions he'd had, the anger, the confusion, everything came rushing to the surface, and he didn't know how to handle it. "You don't know what it's been like," Jamal said, his voice rising. "The things I've had to go through because you weren't there. The things my mom had to do to make sure I had a future." The man's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it. "I know. I know I failed you. But I want to make it right, if you'll let me." Jamal closed his eyes, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to forgive the man who had abandoned him, who had never fought for him, who had never been there when he needed him the most. But deep inside, he knew. He knew that forgiveness wasn't about the man. It was about him, about letting go of the weight he'd been carrying for years. about finding peace. Jamal's hands trembled as he held the photograph. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest like an invisible hand, squeezing the air out of his lungs. His mind raced through memories, fragments of his childhood. Growing up without a father, the empty space at every school event, the constant gnawing feeling that something was missing. His mother's efforts to be both parents, the nights she stayed up late, the way she would wipe away her tears when she thought Jamal wasn't looking. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The words that followed felt like a 1,000-ton weight trying to break free from his chest. Why now? Jamal's voice was strained, his throat tight. Why after all these years? Why show up when everything I've ever known has been built without you? The man's eyes softened, his expression pained, but there was a steady calm in his voice. Because I've spent every day regretting that decision. I know I can't undo the past. I've made peace with that. But I can't move forward without at least trying to make things right with you. Jamal let out a bitter laugh, his voice raw. Make things right? After everything? It doesn't work that way. You can't just show up with some words and expect me to forgive you. It's not that simple. The stranger reached for the glass of iced tea in front of him, his fingers curling around the condensation. He took a slow sip, collecting his thoughts before speaking again. I know it's not simple, Jamal, but the truth is I've been looking for you for years. I tried to reach out, tried to make amends, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't strong enough then. And when I found out where you were, I couldn't stay away. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you the truth. The truth about why I left? Jamal's breath caught. His mind screamed for him to push the man away, to close the door on this chapter forever. But something inside him, a quiet voice, one he had long silenced, urged him to listen, to hear the truth, whatever it might be. He could feel the walls he'd built over the years beginning to crack, tiny fissures forming with every word the man spoke. I had my reasons, the stranger continued, his voice quieter now, the regret heavier than before. None of them are good enough, I know that. But you need to understand, it wasn't just about you. It was about me, my own fears, my own failures. I couldn't face the responsibility. I thought leaving would be the answer, but it wasn't. It never was. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest. The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. Was this what he'd been waiting for? Was this the apology he'd always needed? His eyes locked with the stranger's, searching for some sign of truth in the depths of his gaze. I don't know if I can forgive you, Jamal whispered, his voice breaking. I don't know if I want to, but I need to understand. I need to hear it from you. The stranger nodded, understanding the depth of Jamal's pain, the hesitation that still lingered in the air between them. I was afraid, Jamal. I was afraid of being a failure, afraid I wasn't good enough for you, and so I ran. I thought maybe if I stayed away I wouldn't disappoint you, but it wasn't the right choice. It was never the right choice. You deserved better. You deserved a father who would show up. The silence stretched long, hanging between them like an unspoken confession. Jamal's breath quickened as the weight of the man's words finally hit him. This wasn't just a stranger apologizing. This was a father owning up to his mistakes, owning up to the choices that had shaped Jamal's life. And in that moment, Jamal realized something. The pain he'd been carrying all these years wasn't just about abandonment. It was about the lies he'd told himself, that his father didn't care, that his father didn't want him. But now, sitting across from this man, Jamal could feel the truth sinking in. His father had cared. He had just been too lost, too broken to show it. I'm sorry, Jamal, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could go back and make it right, but all I can do now is try. I can't change the past, but I can be here now, for you, if you'll let me. Jamal's throat closed up, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The years of anger, frustration, and abandonment had built a fortress around his heart. But as he sat there, listening to the man who had once been his father, something started to shift. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something else, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. You've made mistakes, Jamal said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. But we all do. I'm not saying I forgive you. Not yet. But maybe I can learn to trust you again. Maybe that's a place to start. The stranger's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time Jamal saw the vulnerability in him, the man who had spent so many years running. Thank you, he said hoarsely. Thank you for even considering it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the diner continued to hum along, oblivious to the life-altering conversation taking place within its walls. The diner's quiet hum slowly returned as the weight of the conversation began to settle, but the air between Jamal and his father had irrevocably changed. Jamal could feel it, the first stirrings of a new kind of connection, one that would take time to build, to trust, but one that held the potential for something powerful, a chance for healing, a chance for a future that didn't carry the ghosts of the past. Jamal stood up, still holding the photograph in his hand. He looked at his father, seeing him not as a stranger anymore, but as a man who had made mistakes, yes, but who was trying, truly trying, to make things right. I don't know what comes next, Jamal said, his voice steady but unsure. But I'm willing to try. For both our sakes. The man stood up as well, his expression softening. Thank you, Jamal. That's all I could ever ask for. To have a chance to make things right. Jamal nodded and walked toward the door, leaving the diner with the knowledge that, while he didn't have all the answers, he was ready to face what came next. Whether it was forgiveness, healing, or something else entirely, Jamal was ready to take the first step. As he stepped out into the evening light, the city continued its rhythm around him. But for Jamal, the world felt a little different, a little brighter, because for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone anymore. A few months later, Jamal stood on the steps of his apartment building, gazing out at the city skyline. The weight of the past still lingered, but there was a new sense of peace in his heart. His relationship with his father was far from perfect, but it was real. They had taken those first tentative steps toward understanding each other, toward rebuilding a connection that had been lost for so long. Jamal had learned that sometimes the hardest thing wasn't the act of forgiveness, it was the willingness to face the truth, to confront the past, and to allow for growth. His father had made mistakes, but so had he. And in that shared humanity, in the understanding that no one was perfect, they had found a way forward. And so as Jamal walked through the streets, he knew that he would continue to fight for justice, for equality, for what was right. But he also knew that healing didn't just come from fighting against the world. It came from looking within, from embracing the painful truths, and from allowing yourself to heal, piece by piece. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Jamal's shoes? Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that will leave you thinking long after the video ends. And share this video to spread awareness about the importance of understanding, forgiveness, and second chances.